Welcome to everybody, and let's go ahead and get started. So what we're talking about today is integrating specially designed instruction across the tiers to accelerate the growth of students with disabilities. We're going to be talking about 6 things today. The importance of leading with instruction, having a clear definition of what specially designed instruction is, who can provide it, how do we align it with grade level standards, where does universal design for learning, or what I call universal design for instruction, and specially designed instruction link, and then why is this planning so important? The reason that I picked these 6 areas were that these were areas that people had conversations about or questions about at the sessions at CEC. Plus, I want to give a shout out. We had asked people to send in your questions, for you to send in your questions to guide our discussion today. And we only got 1 question after a number of requests. So I'm not going to shout out that person, but the person knows who they are, and at the bottom of their email, it just said "Go Miners." So you know who you are, and I want to thank you. And we're going to answer your question in the process of this presentation today. So I'm going to move quickly because we have a short time together. So put stuff in the chat box, please. So the first thing here is leading with instruction. Academic engaged time, and you can read these slides. I'm not going to be reading slides to you. You're perfectly capable of reading them. Academic engaged time is the total of number of minutes a day, a week, a month, a year that students are engaged in high quality instruction. Academic engaged time is the best predictor of student rate of growth, regardless of race, ethnicity, language, gender, abilities, challenges. It doesn't matter. The more time that a student is engaged in high quality instruction, the faster they'll grow. That's why the tiers in a multi-tiered system of supports are differentiated first by time. Students who struggle need more time. So anything that we do, whether that's problem solving, whether it's IEP meetings, whether it's a triennial meeting, it doesn't matter what it is. Anything we've been doing on behalf of students, unless those meetings focus on instruction, informing high quality instruction, it's not going to help our students progress. Filling out an IEP will do absolutely nothing to help our student progress unless that process of doing the IEP results in high quality evidence-based instruction delivered in sufficient amounts. So this is all about instruction. Specially designed instruction is instruction that's evidence-based to reduce or eliminate the impact of a disability on a student's growth. The delivery of it is not tied to a place, and specially designed instruction can be provided by any person who's qualified to deliver that instruction. So what do we mean about evidence-based for kids with disabilities? The instruction that we provide them needs to be evidence-based for both the disability that the student has and the particular focus of the instruction. We'll see this as we get into a little bit later. And one of the questions, those critical questions that I have for you to kind of chew on when you go back to the ranch is, what evidence do you have that in your planning meetings, in your lesson planning meetings, in your IEP discussions, in your PLCs, when it comes down to designing specially designed instruction for kids with disabilities, is there explicit discussion about how or where that instruction came from, and that it is specifically evidence-based for, let's say, a student with a learning disability acquiring comprehension skills? And if it's not, if we're just, coming up with good instruction would give to typical kids, we need to take a look at that. This is the federal government's depiction of where specially designed instruction and fits into the tiers, and you see that it fits into all tiers with an emphasis on core instruction. So we're going to talk about that shortly, and hopefully that will be a really positive takeaway for you moving forward. Especially design instruction and grade level standards. And that was one of the things that the question was about. How do you address a student's needs when that student is at a grade level that is far above their particular skill level? So the focus of aligning specially designed instruction with grade level standards is to ensure that our students with disabilities have equity and access to grade level content, and that we don't limit that access because of skill deficits that are typically used to gain that access. So a student in the 6th grade who can only read fluently at the 2nd grade level, that student should still be exposed to grade level content. Now, it may require text-to-speech. It may require computer-assisted instruction, but we can't allow a student's difficulty with fluency, because they may have dyslexia or some other kind of struggling with reading, limit their access to content. We wouldn't do that with a blind student, and we shouldn't do it with other students who may not be blind, but have the same barrier to overcome, and that's the use of printed language. So we'll talk more about that. Just as a reminder, and some of you, I gave this to you at the webinar, at the seminar, is that in 2015, the U.S. Department of Education sent out a memo clearly stating that IEPs for an eligible child with a disability must be aligned with the state's academic content standards for the grade in which the student is enrolled. Now, I'm going to have a shout out here to the IEPRC because they have worked over the last couple of years to develop approaches and guidelines and training around how to write IEPs aligned with grade level standards with supports so that students whose skills were below that grade level would be able to access the content of their grade level. And the IEPRC has done this better than any other state in the United States. So those of you in Indiana are very fortunate to have all of the work that they've been doing, and for more training and technical assistance on this, please be sure to contact the IEPRC, and the stuff that they've put together is simply outstanding. The other thing that was clarified in that memo is that in the regulations it says that disabled kids should be exposed to the same curriculum as for non-disabled students, but it never said what that curriculum was. Well, now that memo has made it clear that the curriculum that is based, that the curriculum they're talking about is the curriculum that is based upon a state's academic content standards for the grade in which a student is enrolled. So we're going to be talking about, how do you make that happen? So let's separate something out very quickly here, the difference between standards and skills. Beyond 2nd or 3rd grade level, where the standards are, in fact, very much aligned with those skills. And by the way, as an example, there's no state in the United States that has fluency in a standard above 3rd grade level. That's the learning to read kind of thing. So the dilemma we get into is aligning IEPs with skill deficits like fluency, etc., for students who are well beyond the grade level where that particular skill is actually part of the standard. So the minute that we are, for example, writing a fluency skill in an IEP for a student in 6th grade, without also including how that student is going to have access to content to develop comprehension skills, then that IEP would be pretty faulty. The standard, the specially designed instruction could very much be focused on trying to build fluency, but it also has to be focused on what kinds of instructional strategies and supports are we going to have to enable kids with disabilities to develop comprehension skills, even if they can't read the words. We'll talk a little bit more about that. So above that third grade level, we have to have a bell going off in our head that if we're writing first, second, third grade math or reading access skills, we have to be sure to say, what is the standard at 5th grade, 6th grade, 7th grade? That is the literacy standard for this student. And you and I both know that they're at that point, they're almost universally comprehension standards. And the logic here is this. Look, students with disabilities are held to the same standards as all students. State assessments are based on those grade level standards. And if students don't have access to the content, they're going to do poorly on the assessments, which we know in Indiana and virtually all the other states that share CSI and TSI schools are greatly affected by the fact that students with disabilities are not attaining grade level proficiency. And if we only focus on skill deficits for our students with disabilities, the students may improve in those deficits. They may really become more skilled, but not in the areas that are assessed for the grade level in which they're enrolled. And we don't want that to happen. So that's what this specially designed instruction, integrating it across the tiers, is all about. And by the way, this is a heavy lift. I know it. In my years as a building principal and a district administrator, I know that the more that students are out of alignment, their skills with their grade level standards, the more we have to rely on supports, technology, things like universal design and others, and it is a heavy lift. There is no question. But my wondering is if we can start this a little bit at a time and at least begin to make progress in that direction. We all know what the standards aligned instruction model looks like, that we have standards, we develop learning goals, and from those learning goals we create engaging lessons, which is what we're going to concentrate on today, and then we have some type of assessment to determine the degree to which the student is growing as a function of those lessons. I already gave you the example of a 6th grade student. I do want to point out one thing here. Well, you can look at any of these standards, but let's just look at 6th grade. And this is a comprehension anchor standard. Determine a theme or central idea of a text and how it is conveyed through particular details. Provide a summary of the text distinct from personal opinions or judgments. It doesn't matter which one of those you read. What is not in the standard is any statement that says a student can only demonstrate this by reading complex text, orally or silently. It doesn't say that a student must use written language to demonstrate attainment of the standard. In other words, the way the student gets the information and the way the student communicates their learning and their knowledge is not part of the standard. And that gives us flexibility that we're going to talk about shortly. So why is all of this important? Why is aligning with Tier 1? And it's not just standards alignment. It's because where Tier 1 goes, special ed goes. There's a strong relationship that exists between the performance of all kids in Tier 1 and students with disabilities. And you can read the next statement. It's virtually impossible to move students with disabilities to have them grow significantly if they are in a classroom, a grade level, a school, or a district where all students are low performing. If that is the case, and we're looking at school reform and school improvement, and people are throwing students with disabilities under the bus for making the school or the district look bad, the only way that we're going to improve students with disabilities is to first improve the performance of all students. In other words, improve the impact of instruction in Tier 1. And these are just some data from some school districts showing 3-year data. On the left-hand side is how all of the kids in Tier 1 progressed. In this case, they improved. And then on the right-hand side, how the kids with disabilities in that district grade level and subject area improved. You see the slopes of the line are very similar. And if you look at the next slide, in this district, the students didn't grow quite as quickly, but they grew. Same, the students with disabilities didn't grow quite as quickly, but they grew. Now look what happens in a district where things are not going so well. The students with disabilities, their rate of loss is about the same as for all kids in general education, and this one is even worse. So these are just some data. There's also a report recently out from the Brookings Institute that reiterated all of this based upon reviewing research nationally, that if you want to improve the performance of kids with disabilities, we need to improve the performance of all kids in Tier 1. And here's the kicker that we're going to talk about today. We need to use Tier 1 for our students with disabilities to lift them up. And we're going to talk about how. So the three big ideas are the power and importance of Tier 1, having accessible, inclusive, and integrated instruction. I call it universal instruction. And then how do we plan to do that? How do we use planning to do that? So let's talk a little bit. I'm still looking at the chat box, and I'm not seeing any questions yet. Oh, wait a minute, I am. Awesome. Just give me a second and let me look at, there's two questions here. So in the first question, Deb, yes. So a couple of things here. Remember, number one, that before we worry about whether a student is attaining grade level standards, those are the standards that we use as the target. We're looking for growth. That's the main issue. And for students with significant, severe cognitive delays, most states, and I know Indiana does as well, here in Florida we have access points. So we have ways to align the standards for students with significant cognitive delays. And that alternate set of standards is just fine. It's just fine. The next question was, how do you foster the idea that the responsibility of all teachers? Yes, I'm going to get to that. And it's an awesome question. So first of all, Deb and Ann, you asked great questions. These are the questions we should be having conversations about each and every day, because the answers to those questions will result in a very different instructional environment for our kids with disabilities. We're going to talk about that, and I hope to answer your question. So keep the questions coming, and thanks a lot. So for Tier 1, what does universal instruction look like? It's evidence-based for diverse learners while ensuring effectiveness for all learners. This is Tier 1. So what that means is we could select instructional strategies that are evidence-based for typical general education classroom. Or we cold select? I thought I fixed that. I must have left it in there because I know it's really cold in Indiana today. And hopefully all of you will come to spring break here, because it's not cold in Florida, and spend your tax dollars to support our schools. So thank you if you're going to do that. We could select instructional strategies that are evidence-based concurrently for diverse learners. So we're going to talk about a kid named Brian in a moment. Brian is a kid who's 4 years behind. So the bottom line I want you to think about, and this is part of the answer to your question, is we need to ensure that the curriculum folks in districts and that the leadership teams in schools understand that when we are selecting instructional approaches for attaining our learning goals that are aligned with our standards, there are instructional approaches out there for literacy and math that when used in Tier 1 and students with disabilities are in Tier 1, that those students with disabilities will improve much more rapidly if general education teachers use those strategies rather than something else that might be similar but is not evidence-based for kids with disabilities. Now, the examples I'm going to give you, these are all instructional approaches that general education teachers are usually quite aware of and could use them. But what we don't want to have happen is that when we do lesson planning with just a grade level general education teachers, that they select instructional approaches that are designed primarily for typical students. That's why it's going to be important that special education teachers and remedial reading teachers and others be at these planning meetings to say, if we chose this approach, then our kids with disabilities, our English learners with and without disabilities will profit from that. And it also helps typical kids to also grow. We'll see that in a moment. So that is a big takeaway from today, is how do we get Tier 1 tapped into the fact that instructional strategies exist that are evidence-based for typical as well as other diverse learners. This is an example, collaborative strategic reading. And I'm going to go over this one. I'm going to take a couple of minutes to go over it. And the other ones are the same kind of design, so I'm not going to spend the time on those. But the top dark growth line, that is the growth rate for typical learners in this is middle school comprehension, utilizing collaborative strategic reading, which is a strategy approach, based approach to instruction. It is very much student-led and driven, and happens to have built-in approaches to teaching and experiencing the learning that students with learning disabilities actively engage. The second arrow line on the graph from the top is the growth rate of students with disabilities when instruction is given in Tier 1. You will notice that those lines are parallel. They're actually a touch, the growth rate for students with disabilities is a touch steeper or faster, but not much. And the third line is the rate of growth when those strategies are used, but not in Tier 1, either in pull-out, in some kind of a pull-out, or not being taught in Tier 1. So if middle school teachers chose collaborative strategic reading or PACT, promoting adolescent comprehension through text, or utilizing content enhancement routines with the SIM, strategic instruction model, then the students with disabilities sitting in that core instruction will be much more engaged, and they're going to be engaged in instruction that results in their growth. You and I are always concerned about having our students with disabilities included, in quotation marks, in core instruction, but not profiting from it. And that's because, for me, inclusion is only inclusion if the instruction is inclusive in that environment. So this is one example of inclusive instruction. This is another PACT, another one for literacy. This is the strategic instruction model. This happens to be one of our schools here in Florida that implemented it for 3 years. The orange line is the growth over time of students with disabilities. The yellow line is the growth of students in the bottom 25th percentile. Actually, in the 2 years or across the 2 years time, but across the 3 grade levels, the students with disabilities rate of improvement doubled. And this was simply by utilizing SIM as a way to teach all kids in Tier 1. We also have it for mathematics, enhanced anchored instruction, EAI, is evidence-based. Once again, it works for inclusive and pull-out settings, but kids with disabilities who got it in Tier 1, they grew at a faster rate than students who got it in pull-out. You're all familiar with John Hattie's Visible Learning. There are a number of resources out there to identify evidence-based approaches to teaching in Tier 1 and elsewhere that we can look at being more inclusive. So as we let's see here. Stephanie has a question, thanks. Keep hitting the upside of the head, Marcy, appreciate it. When and how should resource teachers teach skill deficits without compromising Tier 1 instruction? I'm going to give you an example of that in a moment. Resource teachers see it as their job to teach to the skill deficits. It is not the model. Is this not the model they should follow? Yes and no. Let's go back for a moment. So if Tier 1 is doing this, in other words, what we can say from this is that Tier 1 is ensuring that our students with learning disabilities are growing at the same rate as typical students when CSR is used to teach comprehension strategies. However, notice that those top two lines are not closing in on each other. So the students with disabilities are not getting farther behind. They're growing, which is awesome, but they're not closing the gap. So this is where specially designed instruction delivered by resource teachers could focus on, number one, dealing with the deficits, but also number two, focusing on strategies to close the gap. This example of Tier 1, where Tier 1 is doing its job by ensuring that kids with disabilities who are included are not wasting their time or getting worse. They're actually growing. This is the biggest support for resource teachers, because resource teachers are very frustrated that they might make growth, but then students are sitting in core instruction not getting any of it, and their growth is falling behind again. But there are other things that resource teachers can do in the delivery of their instruction to help close this gap, and we'll talk about that in a moment. By the way, for those of you who are on the special ed side listening to this, for example, if in a middle school, the middle school is using collaborative strategic reading or SIM or something like that, in classrooms where students with disabilities are placed, collaborative strategic reading is evidence-based, specially designed instruction, because it's validated through this research study as well as others to demonstrate that it improves outcomes for students with disabilities. So those resource teachers may be providing 40 minutes a day of specially designed instruction. But if students are in ELA for 90 and something like CSR is being done, now they're getting specially designed instruction 135 minutes a day for literacy. So you can now see that additive improvement. So I'll add the other part, Stephanie, to your question in a moment. Any other questions about this? I know I've been talking fast because I was worried about not getting through with this, but I think we're okay. I'll quit talking quite so fast. So the key to all of this is how instruction is planned. What we don't want, and we all know, we're all grown-ups here, and we know that systems have a way of having practices that may be either convenient or tied to schedules, but are not necessarily the best for kids. And we all know that all of our kids these days are struggling with lots of things in the world. The world's a crazy place. And, you know, who would have imagined 10 years ago that we would have opioid crises, and we have kids coming to school that are exposed to that, or exposed to parents who, it's just, things are crazy right now. But on top of that, kids with disabilities, whatever is causing typically learning kids to struggle is going to be harder for kids with disabilities, much harder. So this planning process, what we don't want to have happen is grade level teams plan their instruction thinking about typical kids, and if it doesn't work, that's special ed, Title I, EL services will fix the kids. That won't happen. It can't happen. It's not sufficient. So, and on the other hand, if special ed teachers, EL folks, title folks are focusing on improving deficits for kids, but that instruction is not aligned with either the content or the pacing of Tier 1, then just as those core teachers are kind of teaching in isolation for our kids with disabilities, EL, resource teachers, and the others of us are teaching in isolation for content in Tier 1. And the only way we can stop delivering instruction in isolation is to communicate and collaborate around this planning process so that people on both sides can incorporate stuff from what resources teachers are doing in Tier 1 and what Tier 1 is doing incorporated into resource or title or remedial or English learning. That's the goal. So I'm going to quickly go through a process, but this process has some very specific activities that, if done, will make a huge difference. So I know that changing the lesson planning process is difficult because people have been doing it a certain way for a long time, or they just have not been doing it. And the other thing is, whenever you want to integrate, you have calendar issues, clearly. So some of these barriers can be overcome. And if we start just focusing on a couple of things, I think we can get started down this road in a way that will help all of these kids. So good teaching is a product of good planning. When I was first a building principal, and I did a lot of walkthroughs, I did a lot of observations, I saw some amazing teaching, and I saw some not amazing teaching. And I saw the not amazing teaching, people trying to, cover and try to implement something that wasn't working. And so I began thinking about anytime we're engaged in a performance, which is what teaching is, and I don't mean that lightly, that planning will improve that process. So I started observing grade level planning meetings. And what I found was in the grade level planning meetings that were done well, that every teacher participated and contributed, and that those approaches and instructional strategies were owned by the team, those teachers were the ones I was seeing doing really good teaching. And in the grade levels where the planning process was either random, not well done, or not done at all, I saw huge variability in the teaching process. Our typical students can handle more variability in the presence of effective teaching than our kids with disabilities. There's no wiggle room for our kids with disabilities. It always has to be good all of the time for all of our kids. And even then, there will be struggles. So focusing on this planning made a huge made a huge difference in our school, and our students, typical students, as well as English learners and kids with disabilities, began improving at rates that they had not improved before. So the planning process is guided by the three principles of universal design for learning. And a lot of people think of UDL as use of technology. I do not. I think of UDL as how we organize, plan, and deliver instruction. So the three principles that should guide all of our thinking all of the time is, how many different ways can we present instruction to meet the needs of diverse learners? I'm going to give, one of those examples would be, is if we utilized collaborative strategic reading approaches that has embedded in it multiple ways of presenting material. And that's why you get such an impact from it. Principle 2 is providing multiple ways that students can communicate and demonstrate their knowledge and their skills. We know that students cannot have written language above their reading level because reading and writing are reverse neurological processes. So for our students with disabilities, they may be able to communicate what they've learned, but if they're having reading fluency issues and what have you, they're not going to be able to do that in writing. So what are other ways that we can get at the learning? Now, what our students have learned. Now, we all know that kids get constrained on state tests. But state tests are at one point in time. And as a teacher, I want to know, did this kid get it? Secondly, I want to know that this kid can express it in writing, the kid can express it verbally, the kid can express it graphically, the kid can use a computer to express it. But the means of expression should not be a barrier to me knowing what that kid has learned. So that's what Principle 2 is. And Principle 3 is multiple ways of engaging students. An example of this would be student choice. Another example of this would be having strategies like CSR that already are associated with high levels of student engagement. So when we're thinking about students who struggle, my head goes to, how can I present this differently? How can I give the student multiple ways to demonstrate what that student knows, understands, and can do? And thirdly, how do I think about engagement for students who are more likely to have a predisposition, particularly in Tier 1, to disengagement? So those three things guide the lesson planning process. Indiana has an amazing general education lesson planning tool and guide. And what is amazing about this tool is that the last three sections of it bring general education teachers to think about students with disabilities and other diverse learners. So this is where our special educators, our reading specialists, our EL professionals can really help general education teachers address these last things. So look at number 9, if you can read it. I'm going to make this bigger for a moment. Whoops, wrong one. And number 9 basically says, access and engagement for all. How will you ensure that all students have access to and are able to engage appropriately in this lesson? So what I did here, let's see, hold on. One second. Somehow or other my screen appears law. There we go. Where I have these arrows identifies in number 8 how to use technology and media tools for presentation and student response. That's principle 1 and 2 of UDL. How to ensure that all students have access. That's principle 1 of UDL. And the third is classroom accommodations. It specifically says English learners, students with disabilities. So there's an opening here for our reading specialists, EL professionals, our special ed teachers to be part of the general lesson planning process in the state of Indiana. Whether or not you're using this state guideline or not, this is the best one I've seen in any state, and I work in a bunch of states for trying to get our core level educators to plan in a way that is inclusive from the beginning and not rely on, well, we have people who are hired to fix it if they don't get it in Tier 1. So the flow of the lesson planning are these steps, and we don't have a lot of time to go into this, but I want to reiterate once again that the IEPRC has training, curricula, supports to put this model into a Indiana context. So for more support, contact Jolly Pearsall and her amazing crew to help and get support. I work with a lot of states, and I'm going to shout it out again, that the leadership and the staff of the IEPRC is about the best I've seen anywhere. And I would probably say better, but then I would offend people in other states. I'm just going to say they're up there at the best. So the flow is like this. About once a month, all teachers involved with instruction, that would include core, it would include special ed, it would include EL, it would include reading specialists, math specialists, others. They get together during a grade level lesson planning. And at my school, we did this for a month. We only got together once a month, and we did 4 weeks of planning. As that pacing got off kilter, then we simply communicated that how we're modifying the pacing chart so that everybody else understood. Even though those grade level teachers may meet once a week, it's not necessary for everybody to meet once a week if they will plan for a month. During that meeting, where everybody is, the general education folks are going to identify the learning goals for the month and their approaches to teaching that and the pacing. Tier 2, Tier 3, specially designed teachers and support folks listen to that. They need that information to inform their scope, sequence, and pacing of instruction that's aligned with Tier 1. As those meetings evolve over time, the reading specialist, EL folks, special ed folks, the general ed teachers will start relying on you more and more. You're going to become active in that discussion. It's not a listening process. It's going to be completely collaborative. The Tier 2, 3, and specially designed teachers also communicate what they're doing with the Tier 1 teachers. And step 4 is critical. EL, reading specialist, special ed teachers need to observe in Tier 1 instruction so they can get a very organic understanding of how the students they work with are actually performing in Tier 1. They can also use that time to see the instructional approaches and strategies and can have conversations with Tier 1 teachers about ways to support, to even greater degree, the students that they teach. But if our special educators, reading specialists, math specialists, and EL professionals are not observing in those classrooms, it's very hard to understand how to link and collaborate on instruction so that the students are getting a single message. So very quickly, I'm going to give you a case example. Brian is a 6th grader with significant delays in reading. He has an IEP for SLD, reading comprehension. When he has to decode orally or silently independently is at the 2nd grade level. He struggles with oral reading fluency. He can read 26 words corrected per minute. He has no comprehension difficulties for the words he can read, but you know that rate is awful. And for a 6th grader, it's non-functional. He answers 35% of the comprehension questions about the text he has read independently at that 26 correct words per minute. And part of the reason that 35% is there is that at that reading rate, he's reading too slowly to be able to comprehend. And you know from the executive function research that unless a kid has automaticity in reading words fluently, they're putting so much cognitive energy into sounding out words that they're not attending to the meaning of the words. So fluency provides cognitive space, if you will, to do the comprehension task, but it's impossible for kids at this level. However, when grade level material is read aloud to him, he is able to understand the vast majority of the material and answer comprehension questions for his age and grade. So a trick I have used, that I started using 4 decades ago, is I will talk with, in this case, Brian. I'm going to talk with Brian, and we're going to have a conversation. We might have a conversation about something in a social studies text. Tell me what you know about, right? And I write down words he uses that I think are pretty close to grade level. And after I write them down and we stop having the conversation, I will ask him to read those words. And most of the Brians that I've worked with can't read the words that they use every day, but they know what the words mean. They can use them in sentences, and they can use them in conversation. This is what we're trying to get around. So it is the skill of reading orally or silently that is the kicker. The other thing that I want to talk about here very quickly is that for kids who are fluent, when they're reading, and think about when you read, right? Private speech is our internal language that we use for a whole variety of things, memory, comprehension, a whole variety of things. So when we're reading fluently, we have a voice in our head that is activating visual images. It's doing a lot of things and really supporting comprehension. That process of transferring text to private speech is not as strong with listening comprehension. So when we are going to use technology like text-to-speech, other forms of computer-assisted instruction, we have to teach kids how to use it. We have to teach kids how to comprehend from listening. It's a different skill than comprehending from reading text. And so just putting a kid on a computer is going to be insufficient. We have to teach that kid how to use that computer and listen to that passage being read in order to comprehend, even if the kid knows the words. So and just keep that kind of to the side. So this is Brian. Characteristics of planning. All the teachers were involved with the instruction for the grade met. The standards were identified. Instructional strategies for the grade level and student skill levels were identified. That's principle 1, multiple ways of representing. Explicit student performance options for Brian in particular, and students like him, necessary to demonstrate the proficiency were identified. So if reading specialists, special educators, EL professionals were in that, they would say, here's how you can find out if Brian comprehended. Here's how you could find out if Carlos comprehended. And helping those teachers identify what you already know as barrier-free forms of expression. And technology, if necessary. What are we going to need in Tier 1 to support these students? So here's what happened with Brian. Tier 1 decided to implement collaborative strategic reading for all students in 6th grade as a way of teaching comprehension strategies. Principle 1. Brian and other students with reading difficulties, that they could be students that also were not as fluent as grade level. They could also be students, English learners. Will provide verbal responses or speech to text to comprehension probes, and there are ways to do it. And Brian and the other students will use text-to-speech technology to access the subject area content. And Tier 1 will provide lesson plans in advance to Tier 1, 2, and 3 providers. That can be done on email. It can be done if you guys use Google Docs. It can be done on shared documents so that when the grade level teachers are modifying their lesson plans, then the special ed, reading specialists, and others get it. I was in a district Friday all day doing a problem-solving training for the leadership teams for all the schools in the district, and they're all on Google Docs. And this is a small district. This is a district of just 9 schools. And all of them, when we were going through some of these questions about what does a lesson plan look like, they went right on Google Docs and could get right into their lesson plans. So that's a real viable option. How do you address barriers not being addressed in the state assessments? For example, reading comprehension must be read. So, Joan, it's a great question. And I'm going to give you an answer you don't like. I don't believe in teaching to the test. The truth is that if a kid is 4 years behind in reading fluency in the 6th grade, no amount of instruction is going to catch that kid up sufficiently to take the state test. But if we know that Brian, in this case, has comprehended, has the comprehension, has got the content, and that these strategies have worked for science, for other areas, then we know that this kid is getting grade level knowledge. There are a lot of people nationally who are pushing very, very hard in this assessment revolution to ensure that for kids who cannot read fluently at grade level, and if a test is measuring comprehension, that the reading part of this be removed, because the test is measuring comprehension, and for kids who are not fluent at grade level, that 6th grade test is measuring fluency. And that's a problem. Thanks, Marcy, for the cue up. So you saw what happened to Brian. So tier 2, I'm going to skip this part. You can read it. It's just how to group. And tier 3, I'm going to skip this part. We've talked about it throughout the day. So here's for a couple of minutes left. For tier 2 and for specially designed instruction, for reading support and specially designed instruction, this is what the school did for Brian. Brian is participating in a tier 2 reading instruction group twice a week. That teacher for the whole group is using pre-teach, review, and reteach instructional strategies using grade level materials. They're focusing on exposure to content and reteach as necessary. They're focusing on comprehension strategies aligned with grade level standard. So the reading specialist is utilizing collaborative strategic reading and applying it to grade level content. The special ed person is focusing on fluency, utilizing fluency enhancement strategies, and using grade level materials. So rather than using a box, the special ed teacher is using specially designed instruction strategies, but applying them, even if for Brian, if they're using 2nd or 3rd grade level words, they're taking them out of the 6th grade reading books so that Brian will be able to have exposure to the vocabulary, the meaning of the words that's appropriate to grade level. That is the reach down. Using errorless learning, which is scaffolding, so that the student has success. And with all fluency teaching, always, 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 we do vocabulary monitoring. As kids are reading words, utilizing, improving their fluency, we're constantly saying, Brian, what does that word mean? So we're checking for meaning in the delivery of fluency. The last section is just how the teachers work together to keep the pacing aligned so that special ed teacher is, when utilizing those fluency strategies, is trying to pull vocabulary words from parts of the text that'll be used in the next 3 days or next week as a pre-teach process, as opposed to using wordless or words out of a box that the vocabulary doesn't transfer to content in the grade level. And then finally, utilizing observation in classrooms. So as an exit strategy, this is something that I was hoping we'd have a couple of minutes, but we don't. Here's what I would like for you to do individually, if you would take 1 minute to do this, and then share it with your team. What is one thing that you were exposed to today that you would like to pursue further in your district? Just one thing. So jot that down, maybe share it later. Remember, critical questions are going to prompt you to have conversations about some of these areas. And you also have this document, which is a step-by-step process for how to engage in that lesson planning. It's more detail, but once again, the IEPRC has developed incredible instructional supports for you to do this. So I want to thank Marcy, I want to thank the IEPRC, but most important, I want to thank all of you guys who took your time to participate today. I'm honored that you chose to do this, and thank you very much.